I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, Naturopathic Doctor. Welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. I'm Dr. Jordan Robertson. I'm a naturopathic doctor in what is beautiful Ontario right now as we're heading into the last weekend in May. It's the long weekend here in Canada. And I am recording this episode actually from my family's cottage, and realized only after we got here and after I had decided that I would batch record some episodes that really there isn't a soundproof area for me to do these recordings in. So I'm currently sitting outside, hoping that we don't get interrupted by too many birds and boats as we record this episode. We're just wrapping up a really busy spring. We've put out an intensive course on polycystic ovarian syndrome for practitioners with my online education platform called The Confident Clinician. And in doing that, really had to do a big deep dive back into the literature and research to be able to present to clinicians specifically on the use of nutrition for hormonal conditions for women, as well as using nutrition as therapy for supporting women with PCOS. And that led me up to the last couple of podcast episodes, which have been about meal timing and talking about things like breakfast, and today's topic where I want to do a bit of a deeper dive on the concept of macronutrient tracking or macro tracking, as you may have heard it being presented online. And this is going to be, this can be a really triggering and contentious topic for people to talk about tracking their food and tracking their calories. And I'm going to do my very best to present this in a very neutral, non-emotional, evidence-based perspective, but also with the hints and layers of a deeper understanding of some of the emotion and triggers around what happens when patients track their food. So I do think that when we're having conversations about, really anything in nutrition or in medicine, I should say, but nutrition is no exception, that you really should be looking for a presentation on a concept that is willing to have the conclusion of that presentation be, it depends, right? It depends. If this solution might work, it depends. Whereas so much of what we listen to and see online when it comes to nutrition is getting presented, the solution is getting presented as this end-all be-all, doctor special diet or nurse carnivore or something that's presenting the nutritional solution as being the only way that you can solve your problems, right? And really that's like the sexy marketing way of presenting things in nutrition, is that this is the only way to do it. This is the special and new way of doing it. If you don't do it this way, don't expect any results. And really, whenever we present something based on nutrition, it should be a much more balanced conversation about that solution. And this is no different. This idea of macronutrient tracking, which we'll dive into what that actually means in a second, is really going to depend where a patient is at, where a person is at in their health journey, as to whether or not this is a valuable resource or a complete disastrous resource. So as you're listening, I'm going to present sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly on each concept as we move through it, and you will get a chance to sort of reflect on whether or not this is a solution or a concept or a tool, because really all it is a tool that would help you in your personal situation, or if this is something you need to bring up with your practitioner as a possible option for you, or if this doesn't actually make sense. So let's start off by talking about what macronutrient tracking actually is, or what macro tracking is. And that may give you kind of a better understanding of whether or not this is something that you need to explore as a possible solution for your nutrition. So really what macro tracking is tracking the amount of each macronutrient that is consumed through the day. And so it really is a second level or sort of deeper look at calorie counting, right? So calories is the total amount of fuel that you're taking in through the day. And we can build that caloric intake in many different ways, right? So we can make 2000 calories look very different. We can make it look like a lot of food if we use a lot of, lower calorie foods like fruits and vegetables. We can make it look like not that much food, right? If we look at like a plate of nachos from, a local pub, that could easily be 2000 calories and not be a whole bunch of food. We can make it highly nutritious. We can make it maybe not as nutritious. And so that overall number of calories doesn't really give us a ton of additional detail beyond it as far as like what has made up that amount of fuel or that amount of nutrition that a person's going to take in through the day. And a lot of the nutrition plans or weight loss plans are based off calorie counting, and really you can't lose weight without it sort of being about calories, or about it mostly being about calories, whether you know it or not. But that's sort of the perfect example of the calorie as a calorie concept is in Weight Watchers, right? So Weight Watchers, especially back in the day, I'm thinking about like Weight Watchers when I was 18 kind of Weight Watchers. I know they've tried to evolve the program to be more nutritious, but when I was 18, broccoli and Diet Coke were worth the same amount of points. And so my 18-year-old self had a Coke. I actually had a lime Diet Coke every single day while I was doing Weight Watchers because it was worth 0 points. And so that tracking system was looking specifically at caloric intake and nothing really beyond that. They didn't, and most diet plans that are just looking at calories don't look at nutrition beyond a calorie as a calorie. And I think that's where some of the criticism has come in about this conversation, where it's like, obviously a broccoli is more nutritious than my lime Diet Coke. However, in us starting to move away from talking about calories and talking about the nutrition of the food, I think that that's created the argument that the calorie part doesn't matter, right? So it's like, well, if Diet Coke is the devil and you should eat an avocado instead. Well, not all, like nutritionally, those are not equivocal. Calorically, they certainly are not equivocal. But this idea of macro tracking is essentially taking one step further from looking at caloric intake to talk about the three main macronutrients that the human body needs to function and survive and thrive, really. And to have participants or people track the amount of each of those macronutrients that they're taking in. So you can see that like the umbrella number is the calories. And we're going to work off a 2000 calorie diet in the conversation today. But so the overall umbrella number is that 2000 calories, but we could make that 2000 calories up in a lot of different ways. We could have, there be lots of protein or no protein, lots of carbs or no carbs. So the three macronutrients is protein, fats, and carbohydrates. And the reason that we are perhaps interested in tracking those macronutrients is that they don't behave the same in the body as each other. They each have unique properties to them. They each influence satiety differently. They each influence muscle growth and maintenance differently. They may influence mood differently. They may influence energy differently. And so when we just say, my 2000 calorie Weight Watchers diet, where Diet Coke and broccoli are the same, we're maybe missing the mark on some health outcomes or measures that we would be kind of interested in. Or maybe we need to take a slightly deeper dive at whether or not enough protein is being consumed for what I wanted to do with my body at that time. I was a competitive athlete at that time. And so the difference between, chicken breast and real Coke actually really mattered, maybe even though calorically they were exactly the same. And so this look at a slightly deeper dive at someone's nutrition is going to help us look at each of those nutrients that they're taking in and whether or not we're deriving the benefits from each of those each of those nutrients. But really, it's quite a detailed and more sort of nuanced way of looking at nutrition where, many patients have an aversion to tracking their food or counting their calories in the first place. This solution obviously is as a next level detailed look at nutrition and is therefore not always going to work for every patient. But if we look at each macronutrient individually, protein is one that we've spent quite a bit of time on the podcast. It's necessary for muscle growth and maintenance. It's necessary for satiety. So protein is the most satiating macronutrient there is, even though people don't crave a chicken breast. The chicken breast actually creates biologically better satiety than any other food, that was maybe on that person's plate. There is a biological or biochemical reaction that happens when we eat protein that triggers satiety in our brain and in our body to help us stop looking for food. And so beyond that, protein is really helpful for maintaining muscle mass, which we've talked about on the podcast before. When we're talking about, weight management as a medical topic, maintaining or growing muscle mass is really one of the long game strategies for how we support patients in managing their body weight. Carbohydrates are also a necessary macronutrient. They do have different biological effects in the body. They stimulate the release of different hormones. They stimulate the release of insulin, although protein also stimulates the release of insulin. So it's certainly not a carb-only mechanism of action. Carbohydrates are important for, the fiber intake that we get along with them, important for mood. Almost all of the research that looks at mood and sleep and food, and even headaches, there's some research on headaches and food, look at the balance of carbohydrates in the diet. And when patients stray away from having enough carbohydrates in their diet, we often see it show up as irritability, PMS, maybe more headaches, and fatigue. So carbohydrates are sort of our easiest form of energy. They support muscle function during and after exercise. And so obviously a very important macronutrient. And fats are the most calorie-dense macronutrient, so different than proteins and carbs. Fats per gram actually carry more fuel than the per gram protein and per gram carbohydrate, which means that they're very calorie dense. They certainly can contribute to the way we feel about the food that we eat, right? And so satiety has lots of different components to it, but just the flavor and satiety and benefits, that we have from seeing a plate that has lots of different flavors and maybe the creaminess or the goodness of the plate is usually coming from the fat component. And of course, our monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, like things like olive oil and fish oil, contribute to our overall health and wellness way above and beyond the actual calorie contribution that they're making to our overall day. So you can see that each of those macronutrients have a different purpose, and maybe our diet should be comprised of varying amounts of each of those macronutrients in order for us to achieve sort of the most optimal health with a patient. And where this idea of tracking macros has come in, or maybe where I would see the greatest utility of it for patients, is that we know that in some medical conditions, patients may see an improvement in some of their blood work or biochemical markers of health if we manipulate what they're eating through the day. So a great example of this comes from polycystic ovarian syndrome, which we spoke about at the beginning of the episode, that when we feed women with polycystic ovarian syndrome, a relatively high carbohydrate and high simple carbohydrate diet, their blood levels of insulin and triglycerides may rise. They may, they may see higher levels of those blood markers that show that we're in less control of their condition at this particular moment. But if they're eating the same amount of food, right? So let's say maintenance calories for this woman is 2,000 calories. If she eats 2,000 calories and all we do is manipulate where she gets those calories from,
her body weight is not going to change. Her body composition is not going to change, but she may change her blood work. And so we see that when we manipulate those macronutrients, but we don't manipulate calories, that we see improvement in maybe the biochemical functioning of the body under the surface, but her body weight doesn't change. And so I think this is a really important concept to cover because so many sort of nutrition influencers, we'll call them influencers. Nutrition influencers online will say things like the caloric intake doesn't matter and all that matters is that you eat XYZ macros, or you must be eating too many carbs if X, and therefore the solution is just to limit your carbs. That's not really a solution. When we manipulate macros, but we don't change the overall energy balance of that person, meaning that they eat the same and they move the same, and we haven't changed either of those two variables, really not much happens. We do change blood work. So like women with polycystic ovarian syndrome, if they eat, and in the research, it's called a eucaloric diet. So it means like equal calories. If they eat a eucaloric diet and we just manipulate how much protein did she eat? How many carbs did she eat? How many fats did she eat? We can see some improvements in her blood work, but she doesn't ovulate more often. She doesn't have a reduction in her hair growth, like unwanted hair growth. And she doesn't see necessarily the clinical outcomes that we're hoping to have, but her blood work gets a lot better. So the utility of tracking macronutrients in a eucaloric diet is mostly to help patients achieve better biochemical lab work, right? And perhaps that person will feel different or better if we change their macros. Like I said, if she's fatigued or has PMS or, is struggling to manage like muscle mass or recovery, us changing those numbers probably makes her feel better. But it doesn't necessarily change or it won't change her body weight. Your body weight cannot change if we don't change the energy balance of that system or the calories in, calories out component of the system. It just physically defies physics for you to have weight loss and be on a eucaloric diet or in maintenance calories. And so the utility of tracking macronutrients, really it's a detailed look at where calories are going. And it may help us understand how to support patients and people in feeling more balanced and more well, right? By achieving maybe a more ideal ratio between all of those macronutrients. But if we're not doing it in a calorie deficit, then our expectations need to be pretty moderate for what we expect to have happen. And so if we're looking at trying to achieve body weight changes or sometimes other big clinical outcomes, then we may need to look at the overall energy balance and the macronutrient breakdown of what that person is eating. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of a little bit of the details. And now when you're reading, things online that say, calories don't matter. Well, I guess it depends. It can not matter to you or not matter in that moment. You can see I threw in it depends, right? Calories don't matter if you don't want them to matter, but it's not like they don't matter because we've created a special solution by taking carbs out of your life and now they don't need to matter. The overall energy balance of a person still can matter in their health journey. And macronutrient ratios can also matter, but it depends, again, what we're trying to achieve with that person and what their goals are. So there's some sort of questions that I will often ask people who are curious about whether or not this is a solution for them that is viable or something that is beneficial. And really, when I think about nutrition for people, I want them to be on a learning continuum. And that is the least, I always use the word sexy, but is the least sexy advertising to say, come join my learning continuum about nutrition. But the reality is that this is what we need people to do in order to create long-term sustainable change. And in a lot of the research that looks at behavior change and that looks at long-term nutrition changes in people over time, one of the greatest predictors is whether or not that person learned something through the process versus applied some kind of like tactical nutrition approach without really understanding what they were doing. Maybe they followed the same 70 meal plan over and over and over again until they lost weight. But then the moment that that is over and they find themselves at, a barbecue, they literally have no idea what to do. And that's really what we need to move away from, is this idea that humans don't need radical responsibility for understanding their own nutrition, and have left that expertise and that decision making up to some sort of short-term plan. We need to change the dialogue around nutrition in that way so that people actually can achieve what their health goals are. So is macro tracking for you, right? And I think one of the greatest sort of advantages of doing some tracking of nutrition, and specifically macro tracking, is that most people don't have a great sense of what is on their plate. And what I mean by that is, we can effectively point towards protein. So the research, and we've researched this. So when I say we know this, it's mostly us coming from observational research or research where we've asked patients what they ate, but then we also secretly watched what they ate and tried to figure out what people's knowledge is about their food and what their ability to recall their food actually is. And so for the most part, and in women, I will say most of the research comes for polycystic ovarian syndrome. So I'm going to use that as a bit of an example. So women can point to the protein that's on their plate, but they can't always tell us how many grams is in it. Okay, so they can point to the chickpeas and say, I'm pretty sure there's protein in there. They can point to the tofu and say, there's the protein. They can point to the fish, there's the protein. But they don't know the relative concentrations of each of those things. Women are shocked when I tell them an egg has 6 grams of protein, but their daily needs are about 110, 120 grams of protein. Women are shocked that their almond butter doesn't have very much or any real protein in it. But we can point to things that have protein in them. And so you can see the jump from pointing to something that has a nutrient in it versus having a deeper understanding of how much is in that thing. That's obviously going to be a step in the right direction when we're looking at how to support a patient's long-term learning process about nutrition, or whatever I called it. I feel like the first name that I called it was better. So you can see that there's value there, right? If we plug in, the various foods into an app or something that feeds back a little bit of data, a woman could go, oh, I thought that, this almond butter had a lot of protein in it, but turns out it's like less than 1% of what I need for the entire day. And that learning continuum, that's what I called it. That learning is maybe going to shift her ability to fuel herself in a way that fits better with what her health goals are. So tracking brings awareness and learning to what is currently being done in a person's nutrition, and then maybe gives them some insight of what to move towards. So women can point to the protein on their plate, but they don't know how much is there. Women have a really hard time pointing to the fat that's on their plate. So they're not aware, meaning that it's not that they are oblivious or that they're ignorant. It's that they literally have not learned what sources of fat are actually on their plate. And women have a really difficult time ballparking the amount of energy that's on their plate and in terms of calories. We also really struggle with recall. And so again, if we ask women, what did you eat in the last 24 hours? She has missed, and the research has a huge range, but she's missed somewhere in the neighborhood between 500 to 1,000 calories worth of food in her own recall of what her day actually looks like. So we underestimate how much fueling has been done in the last 24 hours for the most part. And most of the research that asked the people what they ate, but then also secretly followed them to see what they ate, it was a massive difference. One study on PCOS, the average missed calories in a diet recall was 750 calories missed. And that was the average. So there were people above that and there were people below that. And so that awareness of, where nutrition is going and what fueling looks like can be a valuable learning tool for people who are trying to better understand their nutrition, because you can see that we didn't raise humans to know what was on their plate. We didn't raise humans to understand how to build a plate that creates satiety. And we're bombarded with foods that really are moving us in the other direction, right? Foods that are hyper palatable, we, overconsume, we crave, and nutritionally they offer like little to no value. And so tracking can bring this level of knowledge and awareness of what is actually happening in a person's life, and then maybe giving them some ideas of what they could shift towards, because it's going to highlight what the difference between current and maybe more ideal actually looks like. And as a, skilled professional, I can listen to someone talk about their nutrition and find all of the gaps. But the average person doesn't realize what the gaps in their nutrition actually are. They don't realize that they don't eat enough carbs at X meal, and that's why they have cravings at 3:00. Or they don't realize that, by cutting out meat, that their protein needs are not being met, for example. And so that tracking is a really good way of just creating some alignment with what your goal actually is and what is currently happening, so that you can create the habits and steps to get closer to what you want. And I will say, and this is maybe where the triggering part of the conversation is that people often feel like the math in their body is not working, right? I'll hear people or women say, I'm doing everything right. I'm not overfueling, or women will call it overeating. I call it overfueling. And yet I'm gaining weight, right? And it's not a finger point. It's not a blame statement to say we probably don't know the details of what's going in day to day, even though surface level, it maybe feels like you are not overfueling. That may speak actually more to the fact that the foods that you are choosing are not satiety building, right? And so you maybe are hungry or feel like you're not eating a lot. And then yet, if we actually tracked it on paper or tracked it in an app, we don't track anything on paper anymore, that you would actually learn that there is some overfueling that's happening, right? And it's not that your body is broken. It's that the math isn't what you thought. And so that's where one of those values can come in when we're looking at macronutrient tracking, because it gives us that insight. And sometimes as a professional who's working with patients on their nutrition, for patients not to do a deep investigation on some of those pieces, but to hold a goal of achieving a different body weight, or to support some maybe parts of their metabolic health that would be improved if they weren't overfueling, or if we manipulated some of their nutrition. It's almost, and I'll say to women, like, you can't hold both goals in your hand, that you don't want to look deeply at your fueling, and yet we're hoping mathematically that something magical happens as far as weight maintenance goes. We need to be able to do both of those things. And that's where this tool really becomes quite valuable. So if we're on a little bit of that, starting a journey or starting a process, you have goals, or you're feeling confused about where you're at nutritionally, it's a good option, or it's a good tool. It really is just a tool to have a deeper look and almost look at your nutrition a little bit more like a science experiment. I would say, like, hold it out 6 feet in front of you and see what's truly going on, so that we can help support change. Now, the other side of that argument is, do you need to do that deep dive look? And I will say, I think many people who are doing some tracking of their nutrition, it maybe isn't in alignment with their health goals, right? Maybe, being that micromanagey about your nutrition is not micromanagey, that's my word, maybe actually doesn't meet what your health goals are. Or maybe you would be the type of person who would benefit from more of a broad stroke recommendation with your nutrition, and less of a detail-oriented deep dive in your nutrition. So this is why you can see concepts like eat more protein achieving positive things for people, because all we're doing is doing this broad stroke recommendation that's filling a gap in their nutrition, or eat more fruits and vegetables, and then them achieving what their health goal is. Again, it's replacing maybe other food in their diet that is maybe more energy dense or maybe less nutritious. Maybe we're building better satiety or creating better energy by feeding people with these broad stroke recommendations. Sometimes people don't need to do a really deep nitty-gritty dive in on their nutrition. I think it's very valuable. It's a good self-assessment tool, but sometimes it doesn't actually fit what a person's goals with their food and nutrition are. There was some neat research done recently that was looking at whether or not people were sort of able to look at their body as a robot, like food is fuel and fuel fuels the machine and the machine does X. Like, that's not really how most of us think about nutrition. And we think about our food as so much more, right? It's culture, it's enjoyment, it's love, it's connection. And sometimes we can't achieve both of those things and feel the love for nutrition and be micromanaging it from a macro perspective. Sometimes we can't hold both of those goals in our hand at the same time for the same patient. And therefore, that type of nutrition support is maybe not going to be ideal for that person, right? And so that's where we loop back to yes, it's a highly effective tool to do a self-assessment on your nutrition. It's a highly effective tool if it's done correctly and accurately to communicate your life with your practitioner so that they can help guide you. But the flip side is that it doesn't always help people meet their goals when it comes to what they want their relationship with food to be like and the kinds of foods that they want to include in their life. It doesn't always meet a person's goals in that regard. And I think we need to be really open to that. The other thing that is beneficial, so like the second reason why we would maybe consider macro tracking for someone, is that often people don't know what consistency looks like. So reason number one was like, you don't know what's on your plate, and maybe you don't even know what's in your day. And both of those things matter. But the other piece is that more bird's eye view of nutrition, meaning that you might not know or realize what consistency looks like. And so again, often when we're chatting with people about their nutrition, the days that they can recall are the days that they are, I'm saying in air quotes, did really well. I mean, arguable about whether or not we call it really well, when people highly restrict their food, they undereat, right? They have like, a salad or a Baby Bell cheese for lunch and call that a meal. They an egg. We've talked about this on the podcast before. An egg is not a breakfast. People can recall those days, but they don't recall their weekends, or they haven't tracked or looked at the impact that their once a week wings takeout actually does to their overall energy balance for the week. And so what they remember or what they recall are those tougher days where they were underfueling, underfed, miserable, and then don't have a good recall or connection with all of those other days. Or every 2 weeks when work gets busy, what happens to you and what happens to your nutrition? And one of the things that, or one of the ways that this can be a tool for people is to understand what consistency looks like. And what I find that people learn when they go through this process is that they realize that they underfuel some of the time. They realize that on the days that they were overfueling, that it was a massive overfuel compared to what their needs are. And it was changing their overall energy balance for the week. And that eating consistently actually created less ebb and flow between those two versions of themselves, right? Where they were like, felt shame and ate almost nothing on a Monday morning, followed by being exhausted and irritable and eating all the things on a Friday. That creating that consistency actually creates some freedom for those people because they don't have that emotional and energy ebb and flow throughout the week that people often have. And I do think that tracking macros can be a effective tool for helping people understand what consistency looks like in their nutrition, because I would say that that's maybe one of our hardest things to teach people, is how to show up for their nutrition every single day, and doing it in a way that creates just consistency in their mood, consistency in their energy, consistency in how they feel in their workouts from a performance perspective, and not having this like dramatic or drastic ebb and flow between those 2 days. Now, that's a very effective tool for people to develop some consistency. The difficulty with that, so I'm going to try and present both sides of every topic, is that in order to understand consistency, you have to be consistent about the tracking, which is an issue, right? That's a problem in and of itself, that tracking macronutrients probably takes 15 to 30 minutes per day, depending on how skilled you are, depending on which app you use, depending on what you cook like, right? If you're the kind of utilitarian cook that has an ounce of cashews and a half a cup of chicken and a cup of broccoli on your plate, then maybe it's easier than for people who put everything in this big one pot casserole and then serve their family of 7. That's a lot more difficult to track. And so the difficulty with understanding the consistency is that the habit of tracking itself has to have consistency. And when patients feel like their nutrition is a little spiraled out of control, or they can see these massive fluxes between what they feel is success and what they feel is being less successful, nutritious days, not nutritious days, they may also struggle with the idea of needing to do a thing consistently. And so sometimes that reasonable stepping stone for people is not to track their macronutrients to a high level of detail. And it's actually just to eat a couple of meals really consistently through the week. Often one of my solutions for people is like, well, just eat your weekday breakfast on the weekend, right? Like pull through some of your good, again, in air quotes, no food is good or bad, but pulling through some of your on plan habits from the week, pull it through to the weekend instead of having a massive fluctuation between those days. And that may be a reasonable stepping stone for the person who does have this black and white version of themselves, Jekyll Hyde eating, that rather than having to consistently do a habit like tracking, which is highly detail oriented and does take a lot of time, is to consistently do some other things in their nutrition that maybe would give them the same benefit overall, and yet not take the level of emotion and time that it takes to do macronutrient tracking, because that is something that's really significant. And I would say the third sort of reason why you would consider using this tool would be that you need to communicate what's going on in your life with someone else. And that's one of the challenges as a nutrition or person who works in the field of nutrition and as a naturopathic doctor, not a nutritionist or a dietitian. But as a professional who supports people in their nutrition all the time, when we're working with people on their fueling, meaning that maybe we have goals of shifting body composition or shifting weight for health purposes, maybe we need to look at the kinds of foods that people are putting into their body to help support their underlying health issues. When we're working based off recall or memory or what a patient reports, I mean, in some ways, we're working with, like half a blindfold on, essentially. And it's difficult to help support patients move towards their goals when we're not getting a good look at what's going on with their nutrition in their body in all of the other hours of the month, aside from the 30-minute appointment that we have with them, right? So sometimes that additional tool of tracking what's going on, it creates a communication with your practitioners that helps them deeply understand you or understand your situation better. And so when we leave like that, that part of your health unassessed, because really that's like one way to think about it is like, it's like going for blood work, right? So we would never look at you and go like, yeah, you might be, I think you're iron deficient, or no, you know what? I think that your vitamin D is fine. We always test, right? Why? Because it's more accurate. And even though we can probably guess that you're iron deficient if your period is heavy and you don't eat meat, we still want to test it, right? To see the level of accuracy that we want to execute. If you're tired, we test your iron and then we know the amount of iron that we want to give you. If you have goals around your metabolism, if we're, seeing elevated blood sugar levels, and that's something that we want to fix through nutrition, writing down your food actually is like going for blood work, right? It's giving us that level of detail on the system that would then be able to give a more detailed prescription around what happens next. And I think some of the difficulties or challenges are that this is a highly emotional topic. And because people feel so much shame around their nutrition, people feel like it's a value, it's just saying something about them that they need to do something differently with their nutrition, or it's very vulnerable to share your nutrition with another person, that these are all barriers that are getting in the way of people being able to have a concrete, sort of more cerebral conversation about food, because we are often presenting it as if you just found this magical solution, then you would be cured, right? And when we position things like that, what we're kind of saying is that it's your fault, right? If the solution to all of your nutritional woes was that you really just hadn't found the right Instagram account, we're making it your fault. And it's not. It's not your fault that you don't know what to eat. It's not your fault. We're wired for variety. We're wired for novelty in our food, which is why we get so bored and why we can't do that utilitarian style of eating very well or for very long. We didn't educate you about it. Your parents didn't know anything about it. And so what we've done is like literally one of the most important ways that we take care of our body. Nobody has the knowledge on how to do it. And I think if you can recognize that and lean into the idea that we can put you on a nutrition learning continuum. I'm going to tagline that. I feel like it's a good term. We can put you on that whether you're 20 or whether you're 60. You can get on a nutrition learning continuum that would help you develop the knowledge and skills over time to be able to fuel yourself in a way that is the best for your body, right? Which is that like it depends kind of solution. And tracking your food or tracking your macronutrients can offer that insight into what you are doing, and then give us some insight of where we would like to go with your food and fueling. We have to have a slight conversation about disordered eating when we talk about this conversation. And it's interesting because I presented this research to the group of clinicians that I support in evidence-based practice with the Confident Clinician. We talked about tracking food because we just recently did a big module on sarcopenia, which is age-related muscle loss, and weight management. And we talked about this exactly, like what do these behaviors do when we ask patients to look at their nutrition or track their nutrition? Does it create disordered eating to ask people to look deeply at their nutrition? And I think as clinicians, we can get nervous that we don't want to cause harm in our person or patient. And what if this, asking people to think about their nutrition, asking people to write down their nutrition does bad things, right? And it's interesting, the research on this idea, macro tracking or tracking your steps even, is highly suggestive that people that are suffering from disordered eating are doing some level of these behaviors before they walk through the doctor's door. And so it's not the practitioner prescribing it or us having a again, very cerebral conversation about nutrition that is triggering, igniting a fire in somebody's brain, and now they have disordered eating. That is not the right way to think about disordered eating. It is obviously a much more complex disease than my doctor said I should write my food down and now I have an eating disorder. And so, but I do think that us not having this conversation about how people can become more connected with their nutrition is also maybe causing some harm, because it's not helping people develop the skills and tools that we need for them to become, these autonomous people in their own healthcare journey, right? Like, imagine what would happen if we taught everyone how to fuel themselves and how to eat enough protein and what enough servings of vegetables look like. This would be a very powerful public health tool for us to be able to do this. But absolutely, people who have disordered eating or who are recovering from disordered eating, this is not a strategy for those people, right? But that's not what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about when people don't have knowledge about their nutrition. People who are struggling with disordered eating are tracking their food before hearing this podcast, right? Hearing this podcast is not going to trigger disordered eating in people, but it is very triggering if you are an individual who identifies as having an eating disorder to hear that a solution might look like getting more connected with your nutrition. And so if you're listening and you're noticing that about yourself, then it's really important that you reach out and talk to someone about that, right? Not reach out to talk about how many grams of carbohydrates do you need to eat in a day. And I will say, at the sort of grassroots practice level, when I'm working with people and women, I am often one of the first people to identify that disordered eating or disordered thoughts around eating with individuals, and having them seek higher level support for that. And those people are seeking out a nutrition plan. They're saying, I'm eating X number of grams of fat, but I think that's wrong. Can you help me figure out how many X grams of fat I need to eat? That's a warning sign for us as practitioners that those people are maybe struggling already on their own with some sort of disordered relationship with food and their nutrition. And so I just wanted to preface the conversation with that, because I don't think that talking about getting connected with your nutrition it doesn't cause disordered eating in people. But if you're listening and you're feeling triggered by the conversation, then that's something to pay attention to or listen to. So the overall conversation, and just to wrap up our conversation about what macro tracking actually is and whether or not this is something that is a useful, viable tool, I will say, just to regroup on that, I mean, one, it really teaches people what is happening. And based on the research, we know for the most part, we don't know what's happening. And so it maybe is a helpful thing for us to get connected. If your goal is to do that, right? If your goal is to work on your nutrition, then let's look at your nutrition. I think that's a kind of a good way to say it. But the second is if you do feel like your life has, and your nutrition has, some inconsistencies in it, connecting with your nutrition over time can give you some insight as to whether or not your habits on a global scale, meaning like a week or 2 weeks or a month scale, is actually moving you in the right direction, or in the direction that you would like to go. But the third reason would be is if you're going to sit down and invest in another person or a professional in supporting you with your nutrition, I highly recommend that you understand where you're at and that you don't go into those conversations with half a blindfold on, missing a lot of information or detail, because I think that's what leaves people and women feeling broken, saying that in air quotes, because women will say, well, I'm not eating very much and yet I'm gaining weight, or I'm, eating this special meal plan, but I'm not achieving my ideal cholesterol levels, or whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. That without us doing that deeper dive and looking at it a bit more closely, we may be missing something. And I've had individuals who, we were struggling to meet their goals, even though I had them doing, a smoothie, only to find out like maybe 2 months in that they were adding literal tablespoons of sugar to their smoothie because the recipe I'd given them wasn't sweet enough. That was a detail that got missed for a month or more, I could not figure out, like, mathematically this was not working out. And yet it's because the behavior underneath all of the recommendations was actually different than what I thought. And it wasn't until I had that person go back and literally write down, weigh, do all the things, did I realize that they were putting sugar right in their smoothie. And so I do think if you're going to invest in this, in learning about your nutrition, or even trying to put some of the responsibility into somebody else's hands, that you have a really deep understanding of where you're currently at, and to try and look at it from that, again, more cerebral perspective of like, is this path that I'm on actually moving me towards the goals that I have? Or am I inadvertently maybe steering myself off course daily or weekly or monthly, just by lack of understanding of what my nutrition needs are? And that's kind of what I want you to take away from this conversation. Now, I will reflect on it personally because I do think that's helpful. I don't track my macronutrients all the time. I definitely had a long period of time where I did track when I had some really significant health goals, and then was successful at that. I then I've also competed as a weight class athlete in powerlifting, or I should say I almost competed as a weight class athlete because my powerlifting competition was canceled from COVID. But I have done some intentional weight manipulation for the purpose of sport, and had to deeply track my macronutrients at that time in order to achieve performance goals and achieve the weight class goals that were necessary for me in that sport. But that's like, this is over a 6 or 7 year window of time that there's been ebb and flow in times where it's been really important to me, where I have felt off course and maybe had developed some habits that needed to be re-examined from a slightly different angle. Even simple things where we changed where some of our food delivery was coming from, or even through the pandemic when my partner was making, more than 50% of the meals. Like, there had been big shifts in my own personal nutrition that have needed momentary reconnection with what's going on in order to be moving forward on the goals that I had or have. And then long windows of it not being a high priority item, or long windows of where it literally was just not going to fit into my life to do that task daily. And so that tool was just put down for a while, and not picked back up until it was time to, get reconnected, or that a health goal required that level of detail. But it's not a tool that needs to be done all the time for most people to get closer to what their actual health goals are. Most of us are not physique athletes. We're not weight class athletes. We're not even athletes at all. Well, we're athletes, but we're not competitive athletes at all. And so the need for you to have that micromanagement style of your nutrition is going to ebb and flow based on what your goals and needs are, and is not something that necessarily needs to be done long-term and ongoing for you to actually meet those goals. Because I would maybe argue, if you need to be writing your food down all the time, that the learning, like, we're not on a learning continuum then. We still are putting the responsibility of your nutrition in an app's hands now, not in your hands. And so if you're that person that's like, well, I have to track, I actually would encourage you to take a little bit of a deeper look at why that is, right? What happens when you don't? And making sure that you're looping some professionals into that conversation with you to make sure that the food you are choosing is satiety building, that the things that are going on your plate are nutrient dense. Because if you do find that you either have to track or that you're not getting towards your health goals, your nutrition might look like my 18-year-old self, where the lime Diet Coke was replacing a lot of my broccoli.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.